What will happen to the US economy if the next administration is successful in drastically shrinking the size of the government and significantly cutting the spending? While everybody telling you that it's going to crash the economy is wrong. And the reason they're telling you that is because it will crash their economy. In other words, their job depends on a massive government with no oversight and no limits on spending. They want to control you and tell you what you can and cannot do with your lives, and they think you're too stupid to make your own decisions. Therefore, they think that the best thing that could happen for you and for them is for them to take your money and then tell you what you can do. So to demonstrate why shrinking the government will not result in a crashed economy, but will actually do the opposite, we're going to look at the economic principle at stake, and then we're going to look at two recent examples of a shrinking government. The economic principle we're going to be taking a look at is called the broken window fallacy. There's a whole chapter on it in Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson. Fantastic book, very easy to read. I highly recommend it to everybody. I've got a copy right here. This is what it looks like. In it, he details a fictional story of somebody who throws a rock through the window of a baker. This results in the broken window, and the baker needs to go spend money to replace that window. And at first glance, you look at this example and you think, okay, well, now he just spent a couple $100s on fixing his window, and now the window maker has extra money that he wouldn't have had before. And the window maker is able to spend that on buying a new pair of shoes that he wouldn't have had before, and so on and so forth. Showing that at least on the surface, it looks like any economic activity is economic progress, even if it stems from destruction. The problem is this only looks at one half of the equation, that the baker himself is at a loss. Instead of having the window and the extra money he would have had that he would have then gone and spent on something like a new pair of shoes or a new suit. Instead, now he has to opt for either a new window or the other goods that he was going to buy. In other words, real existing capital still counts as wealth, and when you have destruction of that wealth, a real cost is incurred on society. And you have to take account of that cost when you're looking at the benefits of the spending that was caused from the destruction. Now, I bring up this principle because this is most of what is happening with government spending. You take a look at the money that is being spent on Social Security checks, the money is spent on Medicare, spent on Medicaid, spent on education, spent on housing, spent on the military industrial complex. Everywhere the government spends their trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars every single year. You look at all those and think that's income for somebody that they take and they go spend on goods and services, and that stimulates the economy everywhere they spend money. That's a paycheck. That's money that's going into somebody's pockets. That's revenue for a business that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And all of that is true, but it completely ignores the fact that every dollar the government spends was first taken from somebody else, either through taxes or through printing. And when they print it, they're still taking money from everybody just by diluting the purchasing power of all existing dollars. So it's still taking purchasing power from others in order to transfer it to others, which means that every dollar the government spends, yes, is income for somebody, but it is a net loss for somebody else. Only focusing on where that income ends up is the broken window fallacy. It's not looking at the destruction caused by removing those resources from somebody who was productive. This therefore means that every dollar that you shrink government spending by is a dollar left in the hands of the economically productive. Not only do you remove the destruction and the waste, but you also leave the resources in the hands of people who can do something much better with it. Okay, so now we understand the principle that is at play here, but do we have any examples of it actually playing out this way in history? Well, we do, and we actually have one example that is happening right now in Argentina. Many of you are probably familiar with Javier Milei, recently elected to Argentina. He describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist, meaning in practice, he wants the government literally as small as possible, as long as we maintain the protection of private property rights. And ever since he got into office, that is exactly what he has been shooting for, meaning he's been shrinking the government, cutting government spending, firing a bunch of people, cutting a bunch of entitlements, and it has resulted in some massive economic progress for the country. You may have heard that their inflation rate is getting better and better and better, and you may have looked up the initial inflation chart, and you probably looked at this one, which is the standard year-over-year inflation chart. You probably saw that after he got elected, the inflation rate kept on going up and it stayed much higher, and even now at the latest inflation reading, it is still not back below where it was the month before he got elected. The problem with the year-over-year inflation chart is it's measuring prices today versus what they were a year ago, which means that price increase is influenced by a lot of things that were happening before Milei got into power. So the proper chart to look at here is the month-over-month inflation chart, which shows the direct influence of Javier Milei's policies. And you can see it peaked literally the month he got into power. That was the highest it had ever been, and it only went down from there. And now it is down at a year's record low of 2.4% per month and still headed down from here. So it makes sense that reducing government spending, firing a bunch of government employees, and stopping the printing will result in lower inflation. But has that also crashed asset prices? Far from it. This is the Argentinian stock index. And you can see over the last 5 years, the stock market there has done pretty much nothing but go up. But even when we zoom in on just the last year since Javier Milei has come into power, we can see it is up almost 136%. Literally the exact opposite of what you would expect if you believed that shrinking the government is going to result in an economic collapse and a collapse in asset prices. But you're probably thinking, well, the stock market isn't the economy, and you'd be right. So let's take a look at GDP growth. This report just came out from Bloomberg, and it shows expectations due to recent progress on GDP growth for this year, 2024, and into next year, 2025. You can see Argentina is a huge outlier here, going from negative GDP growth in 2024 to a respectable 3.3% positive GDP growth next year. And it is by far the biggest change of all of the countries on this list. So for a country that was headed over the brink of hyperinflation and complete economic collapse, we can see that it has done almost nothing but good to shrink the government, fire a bunch of government employees, cut the government spending, and allow the private economy control of their own resources yet again to pursue progress. Okay, but you're thinking, well, that's fine and dandy for Argentina, but they're not the United States. The United States is different because it's bigger and it's better and blah, blah, blah. Do we have any examples of this happening in US history? And the answer to that is, well, yes. If we rewind the clock, we can go back to World War II. During World War II, there were many economists who were very concerned that ending the war would result in a Great Depression. It would plunge America and the world back into a huge depression. After all, they were looking around and they were thinking, hey, we've got all this money being paid to soldiers. We've got all this money being paid to weapons manufacturers. We have all this economic activity going on as a result of this war. If the war ends and that gravy train stops, we're going to have all of these soldiers, in other words, government employees, who are going to come home. They're going to be unemployed. We're going to have a massive economic catastrophe. All the money that's currently going to all of the industries that are supporting the war effort, that's going to slow down and stop. It's going to result in a complete economic crash. However, they were dead wrong. As soon as the war ended and everybody came back home, we did not see a crash. We saw a massive boom. And the reason why is because they were ignoring the other side of the equation. In other words, they were participating in the broken window fallacy again. They were only focusing on where the money was being spent. Was it true that the military contractors would be receiving less money? Yes. Was it true that the soldiers would no longer be receiving pay or free food or all of the industry supporting the war? Was it true that that would stop? Absolutely. But we also have to remember the brutal fact that governments cannot create value. They do not have revenue. They do not create profits. The only thing a government can do is take resources from somebody else who can create wealth, which means every dollar the government was spending on the war effort was a dollar it was taking from somebody who was productive. So when you actually take a look at the whole picture and you say, okay, what will happen if we take all of these government employees, the soldiers, and we stop forcing them to work for destruction, blowing things up and killing people, and we just let them get back to their lives? And then we take all the money the government is spending on steel and oil and bombs and gunpowder and equipment and clothing, and we say, okay, stop spending money on all that, again, for destruction, and just allow those resources to be used by the private sector, by the economy, allow those prices to fall and those resources to be reallocated and be used the way that people would naturally choose. It makes perfect sense that the only thing that would happen there is a massive economic boom. All these people coming back home and starting to work again. By nature, people have to produce more than they consume because you cannot consume what has not been produced. And so suddenly you have a productive workforce again and you're surprised that the economy booms. And that is exactly what would happen today. Every person the US government employs is money being wasted by definition. It results in a net economic drain. It is not possible to be anything other than that, which means every government employee that gets fired is a person that can be productive in the private sector and actually produce wealth. Every dollar the government stops spending is a dollar that gets left in the pocket of somebody who will use it for value creation rather than for destruction. And while the federal government does have a fairly small workforce, only a few million people are employed full-time by the federal government. It's a small percentage of the total overall workforce. The amount of money that they spend on contractors, which is essentially the same thing, is mind-blowingly large. So no, taking a chainsaw to the US government would not result in an economic crash or recession or a depression. Instead, it would result in one of the biggest booms this country has ever seen. Just remember that every dollar the government doesn't take is a dollar that's left in your pocket. And if you think that's a good thing, you're right. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.